Hello, I'm Dr. Stacey Tucci. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to myself before we get started in today's lecture. I really got into the field of deaf education about 15 years ago when my daughter came to live with me. She is a profoundly deaf child, and I really got interested in the education of the deaf when I knew that I was going to have to be caring for her. So I became a teacher of the deaf. I worked with kindergarten students and a multitude of communication abilities, and then went on to get my master's and to become a research teacher with Georgia State University, which is in Atlanta, Georgia in the States. After that, I became a research associate, focused a lot on early literacy as well as theory of mind development in very young children. And now I'm currently the director of a statewide coalition in Georgia that's looking at language acquisition as well as literacy rates for deaf and hard of hearing children across the state. So I'm incredibly excited to be here with you today, and I hope that you enjoy this lecture. Before we get started with the reading brain, I'm going to show you the learning objectives. You might want to jot these down just so that you can refer to them throughout the session, and hopefully by the end of the session you'll be able to answer all of these questions. Okay, so let's get started with our discussion of the reading brain. First, we'll talk about building the reading brain. And the construction of basic brain architecture really begins before birth, and it continues into adulthood. And brains are really built in this bottom-up fashion in which the simpler neural connections and skills form first, and then they're followed by more complex circuits and skills. And in the first few years of life, there are about 700 to 1,000 new neural connections forming every single second. So after this period of explosive growth, neural connections are really reduced through this process called neural pruning. And neural pruning allows the brain circuits to become more efficient. So if you want to think about neural pruning, it's very similar to pruning the branches of a tree. So you've got a tree, and the branches that maybe are weak or dead, those are the ones we cut off. Well, the brain does the same thing. So those neural networks that aren't reinforced or used often, the brain prunes those, and it gives more efficient communication between these different areas of the brain. Brain architecture, it's comprised of billions of neural connections, and these connections really provide the infrastructure for communication among neurons, and this leads to the specialization of brain functions. Brain development, as I said earlier, continues throughout life. But the early years are the most active period for establishing these neural connections. So these connections that form provide either a strong or a weak foundation for the connections and the skills that develop later. So the foundation for a literate brain is built very, very early in a child's life. So if you'll take a look at this slide, it's a graph of human brain development. So if you'll take a look at these lines on the graph, you'll see that in the first 12 months of life, the majority of brain development is happening. And that's very important for teachers because early intervention matters, but early intervention is what is setting up the literate brain for us in the school-age years. All right, so continuing with building the reading brain, genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences are what influence how and whether genes are expressed. So genes can be reinforced, which can cause them to present themselves, or neural connections can be pruned, which causes genes not to present themselves. Okay, so a major ingredient in this developmental process is the serve and return interaction between children and their parents or other caregivers in the family or in the community. And without this responsive caregiving, this back and forth between a parent and a child, and this can include unreliable or inappropriate responses. Without that responsive caregiving, the brain's architecture doesn't form as expected, and this can really lead to disparities in learning and behavior at later ages. So let's watch a video that gives you some examples and an explanation of serve and return.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Okay, so what that video tells me is that we actually have an influence on the way that children's brains develop. And that's very exciting because that means if we can get into the households, get into the daycare centers early, we can really help to build a brain that's ready for language and that's ready for literacy. And that for me is incredibly exciting. All right, let's move on to an initiative that's happening in the States that's really looking at ways to empower parents and caregivers so that they can implement this idea of serve and return. This initiative is called Talk With Me Baby. So Talk With Me Baby is a public health and an education imperative, and it's really centered around this idea of language nutrition. And the thoughts about language nutrition are just as healthy food nourishes a growing baby's brain, language nutrition nourishes a baby's brain. So the quantity and the quality of nourishing language, just like healthy food, is critical to brain development. A solid foundation of language nutrition is critical to developing a child's capacity to learn. So what are the effects of early brain development? Well, by the time a child enters kindergarten, those with adequate language exposure have double the vocabulary of those children who have not. And so we're literally talking about a 30 million word gap between children who have adequate language exposure and those who do not have adequate language exposure. A strong vocabulary and language base really allows children to develop an essential skill, which is the ability to read. And a critical milestone for children's success in school and in life is the ability to read by the end of third grade. So why is third grade reading so important? Well, typically, third grade is the last year that students receive explicit instruction in reading. In subsequent grades, students are expected to learn to read other academic content. So you're really making this switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And this is the year in which many of our DHH students get stuck in their literacy progress. And this is not modality specific. We see this across communication abilities. So what happens during early intervention matters, but so does what happens in the early childhood years. So what do we know about students who read above a third grade level? Well, students who read above third grade are 4 times more likely to graduate from high school or grade 12. And graduation and health are inextricably linked, even when we take into account other socioeconomic factors. Graduates have a higher probability of practicing health-promoting behaviors like exercise, medical treatment adherence, annual checkups, and recommended screenings. Graduates report incomes that are 75 to 100% higher than those who do not graduate. And individuals who do not complete grade 12 are significantly more likely to be incarcerated, become teen parents, be involved in violence as either the aggressor or the victim, and are typically at risk for being unemployed and recipients of welfare programs. So what can you do as a teacher of the deaf? Well, there has to be a shift in the way we as educators address early intervention. School-age educators need to be involved in early intervention because early intervention outcomes affect us. So we can't be siloed. There can't be early intervention, and as school-age teachers, we don't know anything about them. And there can't be early interventionists who don't know anything about what's going on in the school-age years. We really need to work together and be collaborative so there's a smooth transition between early intervention and school age. Parents and caregivers need to be thought of as direct users of the system, not just the children. So ultimately, children are the outcomes of the adults around them. And we have to educate and empower the adults who are caring for our children. We have to think about changing adult behaviors and think about adult education so that we can actually change behaviors. And we need to consider, how do you connect the learning that happens in the classroom with the learning that's happening at home? So early intervention is important, but it is imperative to consider that language complexity at the age of 3 is very different than language complexity at school age. So we can't just stop at the end of early intervention, even if our children have age-appropriate language. And then language application at the school age is also very different from language application in the early intervention years. Academic application, novel vocabulary and language, the pacing of the school curriculum, those are very different situations than what we're seeing in the early years. Also the setting, the clinical setting versus the home setting, and the clinical setting or the home setting versus the school setting mean that children need to have different tasks to be able to navigate their environment. So students are going to need your guidance and your teaching to be successful in the school environment. So how do you implement brain-based lessons in your classroom? One of the resources I would suggest you take a look at are Dr. Marcia Tate's instructional materials. She has a set of books for teachers, and typically they talk about sit and get or worksheets won't grow dendrites. And the one thing that I didn't mention earlier are dendrites. What are dendrites? Well, those are the branch-like parts of brain cells that actually help carry information between the brains. So they facilitate those neural connections that are necessary for learning. And so all of these books that you see here are things that are very easily accessible to teachers, and it gives you ideas of what you can do in your classroom to not only build content learning, but to build brain development. If you're interested in specific training for your classroom or your school, you can contact Dr. Tate at this email or phone number, and she actually travels internationally, so she's able to provide one-on-one instruction in your school as well as whole school-based instruction. And don't forget social media. So even things like Pinterest, and I have a website here that you could go to, there are a lot of very smart, crafty teachers out there. And so I happen to follow this one teacher who has a full page of brain-based learning resources that are very easily accessible. So social media is a great place to go. All right, thank you so much for attending this lecture of the reading brain. I hope that you got a lot of information, and I hope that you'll join me for the next session that's upcoming, Evidence-Based Practices.